tonight is Indian Farmers Resist Corporatization of Agriculture. It is hosted by the Toronto West branch of the International Socialists. My name is Pam Johnson. I'm a member of the branch and I will be your moderator tonight. And before we go further, we want to acknowledge as settlers, we acknowledge our occupation of our lands that are the Indigenous territories of Turtle Island. Furthermore, we support all struggles for Indigenous sovereignty in whatever forms they take by the hundreds of First Nations and Inuit communities that have resided here for many thousands of years, and by Métis communities that have developed in the last 100 years. And just before we get into our discussion tonight, we have a wonderful contribution from a member of our branch, Muhammad Ali, socialist vocalist, a short spoken word piece to kind of bring up the energy. The piece is The Karma of Brown Folks. Muhammad Ali.
Who am I? Am I not what I'm supposed to be? Let me tell you about these roads that were proposed to me. I should be a doctor or an engineer, drive a cab to pay tuition for the 7 years. They call us model minorities, expected to set examples and show the monarchy loyalty. Never free, indentured in anything that we ventured in our inventions, our medicine, everything. The karma of brown folk. Cardamom chai teas, masala with ground cloves. They love our saris and our steel pan flows, we in their households. But our names they can't pronounce still. Samir, not Sammy. Abdullah, not Abby. The saint some rap name, born and raised Muhammad Ali. Descended from the sheikhs and sings who changed history. How could I hide my heritage? You kidding me? This for Amira, my firstborn. This for my ancestors. I talked to them. This for Prashad, his words of wisdom. Yo. This that karma brown folk living. When they came for Islam, you weren't brown and said nothing. You weren't Muslim. That always got you across customs. Everybody silent, barely anybody called out. Now the NSA tap your phone every time you call out. They said, Mo, stop playing the race card. Hey, Mo, stay in your lane and race hard. Better yet, bro. Speed up and chase God. Let's flip the script. How about you embrace unfair odds? You channel your inner Gandhi, shave your beard in the lobby, hide your accent when you're talking. Oh, they treat you like Gaddafi. How it feel to get lumped in with terrorists. Scary, isn't it? I'm not even Arabic. They don't know what the difference is. Because many men distressed about me. Love in my eyes, God, but they can't see. I'm trying to breathe. They won't let me be me. Some people.
Lost you, Ali.
Could you guys hear the rest?
Just your last thing we missed. So if you could do your last line.
Yes. Many men distressed about me. Love in my eyes, God, but they can't see. I'm trying to breathe. They won't let me be me. Some people trying to take my rights away. They put a hold on my visa. They want me to leave. Go back to Mauritius down by Port Louis. Better watch for the cops and them customs police because they trying to take your rights away. Muhammad Ali, socialist vocalist. Peace, love, solidarity.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you so much, Muhammad Ali. Lovely start. All right, and welcome to people who just came in to our forum on Indian Farmers Resist Corporatization of Agriculture. Massive protests by farmers, which began last year, are continuing to rock the government of Narendra Modi in India. New laws brought in by Modi favoring large corporations in the agricultural sector are squeezing local farmers. This struggle has become a flashpoint for resistance to Modi's right-wing government. It has received international attention and inspired solidarity activity around the world. And this is the story we are going to hear tonight. Our first speaker is Mathew Edassery. He is a social worker from the South Indian state of Kerala and now resides in Canada. He is a member of Indo-Canadians for Humanity and the International Socialists in Canada. Our second speaker is Rohit Revi. He's a PhD student at Queen's University and president of PSAC, Public Service Alliance of Canada, Local 901 at Queen's University. He's an anti-racist activist and a member of the International Socialists. So we'll hear from our speakers first, then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll let our speakers wrap up at the end. Without further ado, Mathew.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Mohammad Ali, for that energetic start. Namaskaram and good day to everyone, and thank you for joining in on this discussion on the farmer strike in India. During early January, when we were actually discussing regarding a name for this event, it was suggested as the farmers take on right-wing and corporate rule. However, at that point of time, I was of the opinion that there are a lot of pro-BJP trade unions and farmer groups who are part of this strike. Moreover, the farmers have been very clear about keeping the political identities and parties out of this strike to avoid any kind of political hijacking of this movement. However, considering what's been happening during the past few weeks, especially after January 26th, farmers' unions have not been shying away from taking a political stand and calling out BJP RSS for instigating violence and trying to malign the movement. So I now feel, along with resisting these predatory corporations, the farmers have now opened up a new front in the fight against Hindutva right wing. The farmers' strike, which has now gained international reputation thanks to one tweet by Rihanna, followed by Greta and other public figures and celebrities in the West. I have to say, although I welcome the solidarity from everyone, because this is a human rights issue, and it should be everyone's issue solely because of that. What is unfortunate is that until that one tweet, the months of the strike by farmers in the midst of pandemic, out on the streets in the cruel winters of Delhi, with almost 200 farmers losing their lives just during these strikes, was largely underreported in the international media. Just to put a perspective about what's been happening in India, so Modi government has disconnected the water and electricity supplies where the protests are happening on the outskirts of Delhi. Internet blockades, use of police and paramilitary force, tear gas, water cannons, razor wire. There are ditches dug deep into the road so that farmers cannot move ahead. They have even made concrete pavement of iron nails so that nobody is crossing over. The government has charged the farmer union leaders with the pre-colonial era draconian rule called as Sedition Act. And scores of activists and journalists are facing threats of all kind. Many of them are in jail as we speak right now for doing their jobs. So I have to say that although all these things have been happening, the attempt to stifle this movement, all the government tactics and propaganda are in fact proving to be counterproductive, and the movement is strengthening day by day. I'll try my best not to divert the attention from the crux of this movement. The immediate aim of this protest is to force the government to repeal the 3 agricultural bills passed into law in September 2020, which was passed in the parliament in rather controversial and unconstitutional way. The laws are designed to deregulate, privatize, and the agrarian economy. The first law, which forces farmers to deal directly with corporations and private buyers. So the government plans to open up private markets, which will be tax-free for corporations who will be the buyers. And the farmers allege that this will eventually shut down the government-regulated markets, which are called as mandis, which ensure a minimum support price for the goods traded there. The second law gives the corporations the power to stockpile commodities, including essential commodities, in unlimited quantities. This was done by the government until now. And this is actually a backbone support of our India's public distribution system, which is kind of the source of food rations for majority of vulnerable populations in India. And with anybody who has any kind of a basic understanding of economics, we would know what would happen when private corporations are given a free hand to stockpile essential commodities. The third law allows corporations to engage in contract farming without a proper legal recourse for farmers. So they are not allowed to approach the court of law in case of any kind of disagreement. And this is kind of, even if they were allowed to go to the court, how do you suppose all these farmers from rural India to fight against multinational corporations? So these are some of the major issues and contentions in these 3 bills, and which has made into the law. And it has to be said that these laws, when they were introduced without consulting any farmer or labor unions, not even the ones belonging to the ruling party. And it was just railroaded through the parliament without proper discussions or debates, which forced the oppositions to walk out of the parliament during this, when the act was passed. I would just like to start to give you a little bit of background because we are short on time. I would like to keep it as short as possible. There's a lot of things to discuss, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So I'd like to start with the background of the Indian agrarian sector, which is important to understand this protest as well. So the agitation started primarily in India's northern states of Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. To give you a context, Punjab makes up to around 1.5% in territory of India and something around 2% of its population. And for decades, it has actually produced 60 to 70% of both wheat and rice produced in India. And this essentially feeds the entire country. And this has helped India to become self-sufficient in terms of food. And in fact, Punjab is known as the breadbasket of India. To understand how Punjab got to such high productions, we have to go back to post-independent India. After 1947, India was ravaged by back-to-back famines and droughts. And to overcome this, during the late 60s and 70s, the Indian government introduced a program called as Green Revolution. This is something done along with the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the US State Department. And this was designed to increase the agriculture output. This was done by introduction of high-yielding hybrid seed varieties, chemical pesticides, fertilizers, also the mechanization using tractors and submersible tube wells. So as a result, there was an exponential rise in wheat and rice year after year. And the government chose Punjab, this particular region, and the neighboring states where these protests are happening right now, because this was actually exceptionally fertile region, well irrigated, high quality soil, and a very suitable climate for farming. And it also had experienced and dedicated farmers who were self-cultivating their land holding. So in other words, this was a region where the government could maximize their returns with these new capital and intensive technologies. It was also a laboratory for developmental capitalism. So what happened along with this boost in production, needless to say, with the names involved in the Green Revolution, there was also a lot of negative effect on the society. From the start, environmentalists saw that fertilizers and pesticides were poisoning the soil and depleting the water table, which created opposition in implementing this program in other parts of the country. There were frictions in terms of caste and caste hierarchy and gender relations. The economists also warned that this dramatic increase was unsustainable and this wealth was being concentrated in fewer hands. In fact, the poor farmers, especially the landless farmers, saw a rise in debt and moving further into poverty. As a result of these flaws in the Green Revolution, a range of scholars and agriculture experts articulated alternative solutions to how to reorganize the agrarian economy. So, and that is definitely not dependent on these monocycle crops like wheat and rice, which was essentially harming the soil as well as the environment. So these alternatives were universally ignored year after year, decade after decade, and we've had periodic farmers' agitation. This is not the first time the farmers are striking or having such a massive protest. There has been periodic farmers' agitation almost with the same demands to raise the MSP, the minimum support price that the government gives them, to account the increase in cost and labor and other inputs, to make these government-regulated markets called as mandis more transparent. So this has happened throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. So this is not something that's happened recently. In fact, one of the most important of those studies was commissioned by the government of India in 2004, which is known as the Swaminathan Report, done by Mr. Swaminathan. Now, Mr. Swaminathan was also known as the father of Green Revolution. He was the lead scientist in that particular project. So in 2004, when he came out with this report, it was kind of a comprehensive review of agriculture policy. He kind of pointed out different aspects in terms of land redistribution, easier access to credit for farmers, irrigation methods, technology adaptation. One of the major, another thing that was on focus during the study was how to address the farmer suicides, which was an epidemic, most kind of a sort in India at that point of time. And it contains serious recommendations on how to adjust and correct some of these problems that had come up in this particular minimum support price, as well as this government regulated markets known as mandis. But this has been ignored traditionally and categorically by both the Congress and the BJP parties who have been ruling India since independence. So there has been a great deal of research on how to fix these systems. And now what's happened is, instead of following up on those recommendations, the government has passed these set of laws that will destroy the system entirely and put it in the hands of private interests. And this way, the way it was passed in the parliament has made it even more dubious. And this is what makes the current situation very volatile. It's frustrating to hear these economists who are justifying these laws by saying that we need to do something because nothing has been done so far. There is a lot of abundant suggestions on the table, actually, and there are so many ways to bring about meaningful change. People have been articulating this for half a century, and yet it has been dismissed or maligned. And then suddenly the government adopts these completely neoliberal laws without any input from farmers or unions or those who have been actually working on this issue for decades. And so we are now in this strange mess where, far from rather a radical overhaul of the system, many people just want the government to adopt its own recommendations from these previous studies and reports. So that is a little bit of context in terms of how the situation arose in terms of this particular laws. Now, the Modi government came into power in 2014 with the promise of writing off farmer debts, but has proven to be more in service for the two major corporations that the farmers and citizens believe are going to benefit the most from these changes, the Adani Group and the Ambani Group. Now, both of these have monopolies in multiple industries. From their own reports, it can be understood that they have been putting pressure on the government to allow them entry into the agriculture, because that's where they can realize most profits in the short term. With other sectors, especially economy stagnating and India going into a recession, both Ambani and Adani's have been seeing their fortunes increase exponentially since Modi has become the prime minister. To be honest, similar things have happened under the Congress rule as well. It's just like how most of the Fortune 500 companies in US donate to both the Republic and the Democratic parties. So right now, Ambani and Adani have found BJP as their vehicle to enact their profit-driven mission. They've had strong ties with Narendra Modi from earlier days in Gujarat, where he was the chief minister. Ambani, Adani, and Modi, all of them are from Gujarat. So it was actually from early days they had this relationship. And indeed, when Narendra Modi did actually become the prime minister, he flew from Gujarat to New Delhi on Adani's private jet. Even during this whole election campaign where Modi was getting elected, Adani's fleet of private jets ensured that Modi was able to sleep in his own bed every night, regardless of whichever place in India he was campaigning in. So this is some of the kind of situation that kind of arose to this kind of nexus between these corporates and Modi government. So meanwhile, BJP wants nothing more than this, to have these powerful capital interests to fund their political vision, which is neoliberal Hindutva. To the usual BJP slogan of Hindi, Hindu, and Hindustan, which means one language, one religion, and one country. Now I think we should add one more, one market, because that's how things are going. So this also means that there's also forceful eroding of regional autonomy, undermining constitutional provisions that protect minorities and state rights. It also means that government control and government is withdrawing from its control and ownership in public sectors to allow deregulation and privatization. And this has been evident in other industries in India, and especially now with these three laws in agriculture too. So that is how large corporations have been poised to benefit from this Hindutva right-wing majoritarianism and vice versa. Just to kind of get you through the Ambani and the Adani groups in India. So Mukesh Ambani's group is called the Reliance Industries. It's been compared to the Rockefeller Standard Oil because Reliance holds near monopoly in every sector that they have a presence in, including telecom, oil, and retail. Gautam Adani, the head of Adani Group, similarly has monopoly in India's infrastructural sectors like airports, ports, and coal industry. According to a 2020 report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development Investment Trends, the FDI, the foreign direct investment in India, rose to 13% to $57 billion in 2020. And most of this went into the digital economy. Of that 57 billion, 27 billion, almost half of it went to Ambani's Reliance Industry, its telecom department, the Geo, it's called as the Geo. And Adani Group, which now runs the largest number of airports in India, from having no presence in the sectors just a few years ago, it has seen a rapid rise in its net worth, and it's calculated approximately that it's increased 340% since May 2014. That's when Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister for the first time. So this just puts him second only to India's richest individual, which is Mukesh Ambani. So these are the number one and number two richest people in India. According to IMF, India's GDP fell approximately by 8% last year, making it the worst performing major economy. Yet India's tycoons managed this phenomenal growth in revenue and explosive growth, to be honest, because of these well-connected business magnates, even during these tough economic times. And most of the people do understand that the success might not be just because of their entrepreneurial abilities, but being rather well versed in navigating the Indian regulatory system, as well as proximity to those people in power. And this clearly is a principal factor in explaining why major foreign investors, like even Facebook and Google, when they come to India, they choose to partner with companies like Reliance rather than going it alone while entering this market. Moving from this, I would like to talk a little bit about the food security and the decentralization process related with this particular three laws. It's rather appalling to see how the government could put the food security of 1.3 billion people in the hands of these few profit-seeking companies. The only way I can try to make some sense of it is to have some kind of a delusional faith in private market and catering towards general prosperity, even though this has been disproven and discredited around the world, and specifically for sure in India. So part of the context here is the larger neoliberal agenda, where public systems of distribution are demeaned and decried and denounced. So then even the most conservative options can seem to be like the only possible option or the solution. So this has been happening even in our political spectrum. So the normal question that we all ask is during the elections is, if not Modi, then who? So this is kind of a dilemma that we are in. So these new agrarian laws deploy, languages like choice and freedom for farmers to create a private system alongside the public system. Although at first glance, it doesn't really look like it's going to affect the public distribution system, these protesters who are actually on this sites protesting against these laws very well know what exactly this is going to happen, because we have seen similar kind of situations in sectors like telecom, in oil, and in infrastructure, where public sector firms have been deliberately pushed into losses while making way and paving way for Adani and Ambani groups to reap maximum profits out of it. This is the similar kind of situation we see globally in the consumer sector as well, in terms of Amazon and other big box stores, even Uber. Where we're given this thing of choice, where in fact they're actually making a monopolistic lobby right before our eyes. So in addition to strangling farmers, there is also the issue of diminishing regional autonomy versus the central government. To start with these, the agriculture falls under the purview of states as per the Indian Constitution. The central government had no business in interfering it, and essentially it's questioning the federal system of our country. So under the public system currently that we have, the state governments are able to charge a variety of taxes and fees on the purchase of crops in these government regulated markets, or mandis as they call it. In effect, the central government is the one who actually pays those charges that end up as income for the state governments. But with these laws, private companies will be able to purchase the crops outside the government regulated markets, which will be tax free. So the corporation would not have to pay any kind of taxes. And this would essentially result in state governments losing valuable source of income and becoming even more dependent on the central government to enact local initiatives and projects. So this is also another reason why there is a lot of protests from all corners of the country. Now, we must recall that the large number of Indians require subsidized food. And the government is only able to provide that because it has stockpiles from being the largest purchaser of food grains from the farmers. Now, with these laws, the government is actually moving out of that role and enables the private sector companies to stockpile essential commodities without any restriction. It also seems like something like where government is kind of stepping back from its responsibility and giving that initiative or putting that onus on individual responsibility. And this is dangerous, especially in terms of food security in a country like India, where we have 1/3 of world's malnourished children and vulnerable populations who specifically depend on this public distribution system for their food. So it also seems, it's kind of, I would like to talk a little bit more in terms of the time. I would like to move on and talk a little bit more about the movement specifically. So the movement has been utterly very remarkable, especially this farmers' strike, how it's been organized, the political alertness and the fearlessness that it has been showing, especially against this government who has been very heavy-handed in dealing with dissent and protesters. The main slogan for this protest is Kisan Mazdoor Ekata Zindabad, which means long live farmer laborer unity. We should see this as an aspiration, or it's especially considering this very complex and fluid conditions in Indian social structure. So because there is an inherent tension between the Kisan is the farmer, and the Mazdoor is the laborer who works on the farms. So there has always been traditionally an inherent tension between the Kisan and the Mazdoor. Usually Kisans want higher prices for their crops from the government, and the Mazdoors, the laborers, want higher wages from the Kisans, the farmers. At the same time, there's also a caste angle to it. Kisans is by and large from the Jat community, while Mazdoors are usually landless laborers and who are Dalits. So a class hierarchy is also working along with the caste hierarchy, which means the nature of this tension becomes both economic and cultural. Just to kind of give you an overview about what the situation is in Punjab, where this protest has been concentrated mostly in Punjab and surrounding regions. In Punjab, there are 32%, the 32% of Punjab's population is of Dalits, which is highest proportion in most of the country. So majority of these Dalits work as landless agricultural laborers, owning less than 5% cultivatable land. They suffer various kinds of atrocities, social stigma, public discrimination, low wages, and absolute poverty. Now, at the same time, in this course of the struggle, the Kisan and Mazdoor unions, led by Jats and led by Dalits, have forged a remarkable solidarity because they have seen the common threat being the neoliberal Hindutva, which will be devastating in terms of well-being of the region. So there has been instances where Kisan unions led by the Jats or the farmer unions led by Jats are among the most progressive forces in those societies and have supported the Mazdoor unions or the trade unions and labor unions led by Dalits in their own struggle against conservative Jats and upper caste societies. So one of the examples that I would like to put forth is an organization who is part of this farmer union struggle, is called Zameen Prapti Sangharsh Committee. So they basically help Dalits to secure ownership of their legally mandated share of common village lands. So this protest is really going beyond what it is as just a farmers' movement. It's kind of moving into a radical equality, and because people are just not sitting and sleeping together alongside. They're cooking, cleaning, and they're confronting the state together. And this is kind of unthinkable of in usually the Hindu social hierarchy, where different castes have different issues and they would only talk about those issues. But this is something where people have transcended those and have come together. Now, I would also like to say that, this does not mean that the caste-based discrimination is going to evaporate all of a sudden and this exploitation is going to stop. But this is a hope, and this is a step in the right direction, especially in those regions. And this struggle will further empower Kisans, the farmers and the laborers, to bring about greater equity in the society. And this is something that's great to be looking at. I would also like to kind of go a little bit further ahead in my talk and jump into something where there's a lot that global movements and people everywhere around the world can learn a lot from this movement. For example, we are seeing, how this whole mass politicization campaign is happening. Direct actions against corporate interests are happening. Simply the logistical feat that has sustained hundreds of thousands of people on the streets for months in this cruel winter is astounding. And just to give you an example, over the summer, so this protest had been silently being planned by the farmers' unions and the trade unions for quite some time, ever since this bill was in discussion from the ruling party. They have had massive information campaigns with pamphlet distribution and extensive grassroots level approach outreach, explaining laws to people. And and this is just in a few districts. They've done it almost everywhere in those regions. So what happens is when you watch a random YouTube clip or whatever videos that you see on YouTube or social media these days, the ordinary person who is actually at that protest site has more information than somebody sitting in a media studio in Delhi or Bombay trying to explain these laws. So it's something phenomenal that's happening in that sense too. And I would like to move ahead and touch about a little bit about what the situation is in terms of this global protest also has been happening, and the solidarity that we've been seeing across different nations as well. Now, part of the matter is that after this Green Revolution happened in India, many of the developed nations, especially countries like Canada, US, UK, and like other parts in Europe as well, actually invited the Sikh community and the Punjab community to come to their nations and get into agrarian practices to replicate the success of Green Revolution. And this has essentially been one of the major migration points of Sikhs to different parts of the world. And most of the people who are actually protesting over here are people who are directly involved in farming, or family of farmers, and some people even own land there right now. Maybe it's family land, and maybe it's their own lands, but there is definitely that kind of a tie with the lands that's over there in Punjab. So that's why the protest is so much emotional and so much close to their hearts over here. And that's why we can see a lot of protests happening in these parts of the world. Especially like the Sikh community is also very strong politically, socially, economically. And we can see that when Justin Trudeau was one of the first leaders to come out with a solidarity statement during the early stages of the strike. Even parties like NDP and some of the left-wing parties have also been trying to get this out on this public discourse. So I would like to just wrap up at the earliest, because I would like to give some more time to Rohit, and then we can probably have some discussions as well. So I would like to end by saying that the solution in front of the government is very clear. Just repeal the 3 laws and the strike ends. Listen to the farmers, do what they believe is the best for them. It's not something that cannot be done. And we have decades of studies funded by taxpayers. We can just implement those studies and reports that has already been there on the table. So I would like to close by saying my solidarity to the brave farmers who are facing this government. And thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a fantastic, comprehensive background, and an absolutely astounding struggle. So I'm going to give the floor to Rohit, who's going to continue and talk a little bit more about what's been going on and also what's happened in Canada. Thank you. Go ahead, Rohit.
Thank you, Pam, and good evening, comrades. I'm inspired by everyone who's here and for your solidarity. And thank you so much, Matthew. I think you have been able to bring out like a really detailed picture of the corporatization and as well as the resistance that marks this legislation that and what we are seeing today in India. This the point that you made about the organic connection that's developing between the anti-caste, anti-oppression movement as well as the anti-capitalist movement. It's definitely something that that really should be foregrounded. I think I'd like to try to take it from here and talk about two things. First, I think about like the global dimensions of this resistance and try to place this within the context and try to forge some links between the anti-CAA protests that we have seen, as well as the with the ongoing farmers protest, and then try to make a couple of points about the longer history of agrarian crisis in India and why we shouldn't see this as a spontaneous eruption of a protest, but something that has that is in response to a longer history that which has been perpetuated by the agribusiness interests, which Matthew has referred to. So first of all, I'll speak a little bit about the global resistance that's ongoing. So this is, as you know, the second wave of mass protest in India in recent times. The first wave was following the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was an Islamophobic act that selectively disenfranchises the migrants to India of Islamic faith. So during the anti-CAA protests, the movement in India was largely led by faith-based groups, Muslim organizations, the Ambedkarite anti-caste groups, which are also constitutionalist groups, as well as student organizations. All of this was carried out with significant support, definitely from leftist organizations and workers' unions. So at that time, as a result, even in Canada and in the broader West, when the protest found reflections or when the protest caught on, here too, it was led by students at universities in conjunction with faith-based organizations, with Muslim organizations, as well as some Indo-Canadian groups with voices of religious minorities of India, which kept forward a demand for secularism. So this was largely expressed through a broader language of constitutionalism and of protecting the secular values of the Indian constitution. And at the time, the Indian government had tried to frame all the support from the West as purely support of Islamists funded by the enemies of the state, such as Pakistan, China, and so on. So it's kind of like we say like patriotism is the last resort of the scoundrel, and it's really kind of the defining feature of the Modi regime, basically. But so after that, today we are witnessing that back home in India, that the intensity of protests, as Matthew correctly pointed out, has been the greatest in two states, and this is Punjab and Haryana, and there are many reasons for this. First of all, both are predominantly agrarian states with a kind of strong organizations of landholding farmers of the upper layers of the Indian peasantry. And secondly, these are states which are closest to Delhi, so the farmers are able to engage in more disruptive strategies, such as occupying highways, closing down the borders to the capital city, and so on. And thirdly, of course, like the Sikh religious community with a strong culture of community organizing and a sense of fraternity made it possible to overcome state infiltration into the movement and to and all the attempts that the Indian media with hand in gloves with the state has been trying to do to fracture the movement. So even now, it's similar to the anti-CAA protests. We can see that the government is trying to isolate these issues as issues specific to Punjab and Haryana, as issues that that are countering the security of the state and so on and so forth, which I'll talk about a little bit about that angle. But one thing I want to foreground at is that this is a nationwide demand, and this is echoed by the farming communities across the country, but it is only expressed in the most kind of conscious sense as a movement at the borders of Delhi, and that is because of some of the reasons that I mentioned, proximity and so on. And now when we look at the global reflections of this protest, we obviously see that, first of all, the Punjabi diasporic community has taken the lead everywhere. The Punjabi diaspora here in Canada especially is quite sizable, both among the international student community and also among the more rooted families who have been here for longer. And all these groups have strong familial ties to the farmers back home. And just the size of the resistance or like solidarity actions have been, as you know, kind of unprecedented. In Kingston here, we witnessed actually one of the biggest car rallies in the city, I would say, or at least since what I've seen, where the community stood in strong solidarity with the farmers back home. And this has been the case in other cities. And I just wanted to make a quick point that this is really, we should think of it also as an opportunity for the Canadian working class to win the faith and the trust of the migrant communities here, who are workers in the unorganized sectors of Canada. So currently, a lot of that faith stands with the Liberal Party or the NDP, and despite of how time and time again these parties have failed migrant workers' interests. And so standing in solidarity with the protesters here is not just to support the farmers in India back home, but also to draw the migrant voices within the Canadian labor movement closer to the movement, draw the voices into the labor movement. And it is definitely something that is in the interest of the labor movement here. So one of the large migrations of the Punjabi community to Canada and to the West broadly was in response to, among other things, state persecution, which happened during the movement for Khalistani independence, or Punjabi sub-nationalist movement that peaked in the 80s. So at this period, state repression was quite high. It was the Congress government, and many people found refuge here. So naturally, today, among the earlier Punjabi communities who have settled in Canada, there is definitely a sentiment that is critical of any attack on provincial autonomy. And as Mathew has pointed out, like there is this by overriding the state role in determining the sector of agriculture by kind of like trying to impose a uniform top-down legislation. There is definitely like an attack on provincial autonomy that people from outside the central belt of the Indian kind of power core, such as people from the south and people from Punjab and Haryana, it doesn't neatly, it doesn't sit very well. So even in this case, so naturally there's a critique of that kind of centralization. Another point I want to quickly make was that the Punjabi community here has also been a strong part of the anti-CA protest, and this is because Punjab has experienced the trauma of Hindu-Muslim communalism the most, because Punjab is during the partition of India and Pakistan, and that trauma and that kind of like the stakes of communal rights and the stakes of communal divides is clear to the community. So there's definitely like a strong secular ethos that is articulated within the politics, and this, as you know, was reflected within the anti-CA protests as well. So in today's situation, in much the same way as patriotism was the last resort of the scoundrel, the government's response in this case has been also to frame protesters in the same way they did during the anti-CA protest. This time as kind of anti-India terrorists who are trying to rekindle some form of separatism in the form of, in the guise of farmers' protests and so on. So when Rihanna and Greta Thunberg and the lights tweeted out in support of the farmers, and there was like a global kind of attention that was being developed, the government in return develops, the government of India in return develops a paranoid narrative that is in response, that's saying basically that there is a global conspiracy of vested interests that are trying to undermine the unity of India, etc., etc. So, so in response to Rihanna and Greta Thunberg's tweets, the government of India mobilized a network of celebrity ruling class in India. And India, this basically means Bollywood actors, cricket players, and businessmen. This is like the holy trinity of the Indian ruling class. And they kind of got them to tweet back, tweet in response with a message of Indian unity and India against propaganda, India against foreign influence into internal affairs, and so on. So in many ways, the government response during the anti-CA protests and the farmers' protests have been somewhat similar. Recently, this is something that's like scary, is that the government of India issued a statement to all universities saying that any event on the internal matters of India must be first approved by the Ministry of External Affairs or by the government. And we are also told that, like, at the level of the consulate, there has been notification to keep an eye out for activists speaking out against the interests of the state and so on. From the anti-CA protests and onwards, we know that many Muslim student activists in India and activists from the are in prison back home and continue to be denied even the basic rights to a free trial. So it's getting more and more dangerous. But at the same time, there are differences in that, like, when the state repression was definitely much more violent against the anti-CA protests, and this is because of the nature of the Islamophobic nature of the state, as well as their repressive approach to the student movements. In the case of the farmers' protests, there is definitely more support coming in from humanitarian agencies, as well as maybe a little bit of a growing consensus among the Indian middle class as well. So the state has not used violence so far in the same way. But I just want to say that it is definitely a big mistake to separate out the anti-CA protests from the farmer protests, and this is something that many journalists and many media outlets and even leftists in India often do by treating them as separate and like disjunct from one another. There are definitely important links to be made. First of all, that the anti-CA protest was able to initiate a culture of mass movement in India, which had been long lost since the liberal reforms of the 90s and the attacks on the union militancy in prior. So this popular voice that began to be expressed directly on the streets without much institutional backing at the time was sustained over a period of months, and this was relatively new. And until the anti-CA protests, the protests in modern India and in Delhi had been largely more sporadic and in the form of single-day strikes or demonstrations. But with the anti-CA protests, there was um, strategies of occupying parks and public spaces over long periods of times, of kind of building coalitions between students, workers, and minority groups, which became possible once more in India. And this is perhaps for the first time since the 1970s of Indira Gandhi's declaration of emergency and the protests that followed that. So anti-CA protests exposed a kind of lack of public confidence in the government and brought confidence back to a culture of mass movement. I believe that sets a kind of a cultural precedent for sustained mass movements, which now farmers unions have been able to follow at more organizational level through, and there is more of like a labor voice in that sustained movement. So now back to back, we have seen two sustained and historic mass movements. And of course, this is not to say that the fight against CA has served its purpose or anything, or that, but more that the return of this culture of mass movement brings a lot of optimism. It brings with now farmers unions now having the confidence to take on the state and sustain the struggle over a period of time. It's kind of setting the stage for more developed confidence among workers unions also to kind of drive forward with the same confidence. And I think I will just open up, stop here and maybe let's have interventions from everyone, and maybe if I have some more thoughts I can express at the end.
Thank you so much, Rohit. So yes,